Welcome all. Here we are to discuss the fourth part in the series History of English Literature, and in this part we will be discussing the Age of Milton and the Age of Restoration. So I hope you would have watched the first three parts, which comprises the Anglo-Saxon literature, the Age of Chaucer, early Renaissance, the Age of Shakespeare, etc. So let's get into the fourth part, the Age of Milton and the Age of Restoration. The Age of Milton, the Age of Puritanism or Caroline Age. So Puritanism was the religion of all those who wished to purify the rituals of the established church from the taint of Roman Catholicism. The Caroline Age, named after Charles I, the King of England at that time, was an era of political tensions between Charles I and the Parliament comprising the Puritans. England was divided into two factions on the issue of who should have the upper hand in affairs of the state, the King or the Commons. The Royalists or Cavaliers, who strongly supported the king and the divine right theory of kings, formed one group, and the other group comprised the Puritans or Roundheads or Independents, who stood for righteousness and liberty. Puritan literature was serious, critical, and intellectual in spirit because life was considered a moral struggle, while Elizabethan literature was highly romantic. The greatest part of Milton's life was spent in the Caroline Age, though he could experience the ignominy of being a Puritan in Restoration times. John Milton. John Milton was the greatest English poet after Shakespeare. Milton's early poems were written during the period of his stay at Hawthorne from 1629 to 38. On the morning of Christ's Nativity, his first poem, then El Allegro, which in Italian means the happy man, and Il Penseroso, which in Italian means the serious man, Comus, a masque, and Lycidas, a pastoral elegy written on the untimely death of his college mate Edward King, and a few sonnets were written during this period. Milton devoted the middle years of his life to prose writings, mainly tracts on education and divorce. Aeropagitica, a treatise on the freedom of press, is directed against an Act of Parliament which established a censorship of books. His finest poetry was written in the later period of his life that comprises the poems Paradise Lost, a classical epic in 12 books, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes, a choral drama. The metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical, as applied to poetry, was first used by Dr. Johnson, who borrowed it from Dryden's phrase for done. He affects the metaphysics. The chief characteristics of metaphysical poetry are delight in novel thoughts and expressions, the usage of far-fetched images like conceits which finds similarity in things dissimilar, then obscurity, learning, and the poems were religious and amorous. Metaphysical poets. John Donne was the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry. His works include satires, songs and sonnets, and elegies. A valediction forbidding mourning, a hymn to God the Father, of the progress of the soul, etc., are his well-known poems. The other metaphysical poets are George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan, Thomas Carew, Abraham Cowley, and Andrew Marvell. Cavalier poets. I have mentioned about Cavaliers before, and the Cavalier poets opposed metaphysical poetry such as that of John Donne. While poets like John Donne wrote with a spiritual, scientific, and moral focus, the Cavalier poets concentrated on the pleasures of the moment. They were lyrical and dealt with love and war. They emulated Ben Jonson in classical restraint and clarity. The major Cavalier poets include Robert Herrick, whose collections of poetry include the Noble Numbers and Hesperides, which are both sacred and profane. Richard Lovelace, whose collection Lucasta contains lyrics such as "To Althea from prison" and "To Lucasta going towards," etc. Then Sir John Suckling's poems "Ballad upon a Wedding" and "Fond Lover," etc. reflect his gaiety, generosity, and wit. Then Thomas Carew, whose poems include "Celia" and "Disdain Returned." Prose. There was a remarkable advance in prose style during the age of Milton. During that period, we have many religious prose works as well as essays. The religious prose include Jeremy Taylor's The Liberty of Prophesying, Holy Living, Holy Dying, etc. Then Richard Baxter's Saints' Everlasting Rest, Thomas Fuller's The History of the Holy War, The Church History of Britain, Good Thoughts in Bad Times, etc. The essays of the period include Owen Feltham's Resolves, Divine, Moral, Political, and On Death. Then William Drummond's A Cypress Grove, and Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon's Contemplations and Reflections upon the Psalms of David and Essays, Divine and Moral. Then Abraham Cowley's Of Myself, James Orwell's Epistolae, Lord Halifax's The Character of a Trimmer, Advice to a Daughter, William Temple's Letters, Memoirs, Miscellanea, and very importantly Sir Thomas Browne's Religio Medici. It is a curious mixture of religious faith and scientific skepticism. It is subtitled as The Religion of a Doctor. His other works include Vulgar Errors, Urn Burial or Hydrotaphia, Garden of Cyrus, and Christian Morals. Literature in the Restoration Age. The Restoration marks a complete breakup with the past. The writers, both in prose and poetry, tacitly agreed upon the rules and principles in accordance with which they should write. It was called the correct school. Correctness means avoidance of enthusiasm, moderate opinions moderately expressed, strict care and accuracy in poetical technique, and humble imitation of the style of the Latin classics. The authors of the period turned to the great classical writers, particularly Latin, for guidance and inspiration. Thus grew the neoclassical school of poetry. Characteristics of the school. The neoclassicist could not soar to great imaginative heights or could not delve deep into human emotions. Clarity, directness, and elegance became the watchwords of poetry. They directed their attention to the slavish imitation of rules and ignored the importance of subject matter. There was a tendency to emulate the French writers. Wit and reason took the place of imagination, and the writers tried to give a realistic picture of a corrupt court and society. They took great care in poetic form and technique. John Dryden. Dryden was the representative writer of his age. Since he dominated this age, it is also known as the Age of Dryden. He laid the foundation for the neoclassical or correct school of poetry, later perfected by Alexander Pope. Dryden's first poem, Heroic Stanzas, was a series of heroic stanzas on the death of Cromwell. Ennis Mirabilis gives an account of the Great Fire of London and a war with the Dutch in the previous year. Absalom and Achitophel is a fine, finished satire. Medal is an attack on Shaftesbury. Macflegno is a scathing personal attack on a former friend, Thomas Shadwell. The Hind and the Panther is an allegorical defense of the Roman Catholic Church. The other poets of the period include Samuel Butler, whose Hudibras is a pointed satire on Puritans. The name Hudibras comes from the Fairy Queen. Then John Oldham, who has written satire against virtue, satire upon a woman, and satire upon Jesuits. And Bishop Ken, who has written morning and evening hymns. Restoration prose. Restoration marks the beginning of modern prose. The prose of the age of Milton was too intricate for ordinary use. The sentences were long and based on Latin syntax. In the new prose of Dryden's time, the sentences become shorter and simpler, and classical ways of expression are done away with. This made writing and reading easier. Dryden's well known essay on dramatic poesy and the prefaces to his dramas and poems gave voice to the representative character of Restoration prose. John Bunyan was a belated Puritan in the Restoration period. Grace Abounding is his religious autobiography. The Pilgrim's Progress Journey of Christian the Pilgrim from the City of Destruction to the Celestial City is his masterpiece. The Life and Death of Mr. Badman and The Holy War are his other allegorical works. So the prose works continue. Lord Halifax's Miscellanies, Sir William Temple's Memoirs and Miscellanea, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and Sir John Locke's famous Essay Concerning the Human Understanding are the prose works of the period. And theological prose of the period include John Tillotsen's Sermons and Cudworth's Intellectual System of the Universe. And there were a few diarists who have written diaries like Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn. Restoration drama. Drama had suffered a setback during the Puritan rule. Theatres were closed and the staging of plays were banned. However, drama was restored in the English stage during the Restoration period. There was also great improvement in stagecraft. The playhouses were completely roofed. The stage was artificially lighted with candles. Curtains with paintings were used for the first time. The advent of female actors was another significant change, because women replaced young boys, as was the practice in Shakespearean theatre. The travelling companies of actors had dwindled to a large extent, and the provinces did not have any fixed permanent theatres like the Theatre Royal in London. Thus, drama was confined to London and appealed to a courtly audience and the upper classes. Restoration comedy or comedy of manners. Restoration comedy drew its inspiration from the native tradition that was prevalent before the closing of the theatres in 1642. It was indebted to Beaumont and Fletcher and Ben Jonson. Continental writers like Molière and Calderon also had tremendous influence on Restoration comedy. Molière provided English dramatists with example of fine comic characterization. Spanish drama strengthened the love of intrigue, that is, devices like disguise, eavesdropping, forging of letters, etc., and incident that was already established in English comedy. The comedy of manners reflected the fashionable life of upper class society and thus catered to the affectations and dalliance of the demoralized Restoration society. It confined its scenes to the drawing rooms, coffee houses, streets, and parks of London. Sex was treated with utter frankness. Woman was delineated as the companion of man and as one who should be won by intelligence, wit, and charming manners. William Congreve's The Way of the World, George Etheridge's The Comical Revenge or Lavinetta, Sir John Vanbrugh's The Confederacy, and George Farquhar's Love and a Bottle are the major works of the period. Restoration tragedy or the heroic play. The heroic tragedy dealt with the conflict between love and honor or love and duty in a high rhetorical manner. They were influenced by the French romance and drama. The most striking aspect of heroic tragedy is its artificiality. It created an escape world for the degenerate aristocracy. Emphasis was laid on valor, beauty, and love. Hence, admiration replaced pity and fear in these plays. Sensationalism, violence, and bloodshed were the characteristics of Restoration tragedy. The three classical unities were observed, and tragic and comic elements were never mixed. The heroic tragedy was written in heroic couplet and blank verse. Dryden's All for Love, Thomas Otway's The Orphan, Nathaniel Lee's The Rival Queens, and Elkanah Settles the Empress of Morocco are the famous works of the period. So here ends the Restoration Age, and we'll meet to discuss Augustan Age in the next video. Thank you all.